Hey everyone, Internet PCS book reader here. Today I want to talk about Taiwan story, how a small island will dictate the global future by Gary Brown. Taiwan is one of those countries that usually internet only kept in mind to hate on China, which a bit somewhat fair, but it's also very chronically online behavior. I mean, the last time Taiwan is viral on the internet is only during the Red Candle game scandal. Let me explain a little bit. Red Candle Game, as the name of the company suggests, is an indie game developer that nowadays is mostly known from their latest game Nine Souls, a Metroidvania game that one day I also want to stream. But before they made Nine Souls, they're indie developer that used to make horror game. Their first game, Detention, is a horror game based on a school setting that highlighted the White Terror event, and their second game, Devotion, that became controversial, is another horror game that highlighted the harm of cult and pseudoscience. Nowadays, this kind of game might be called woke, and that's why it was controversial. But back then, people on the internet are not as reactionary about these subjects. What made it controversial was this one paper in the background of the game that compared Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh. A meme about how similar both of them are, which unfortunately a ton of Chinese people on the internet did not take as compliment. There was an outrage because of that one paper that resulted in the developer games being outed from any gaming platform, including the gambling company Valve. Then there is an outrage about that outrage that resulted in Taiwan being trending for that one moment. But if you paid attention, the outrage is not even for Taiwan's sake. It was either to hate on China or to defend the small indie game developer Red Candle Game. People still have no idea about Taiwan and why it's such a vital country to the future of the world, which is where this book came in. When we're talking about Taiwan and China relation, it's easy to get bogged down by semantics because China, or more specifically, Republic of China did not exist before World War II. China itself was run with both parts. One is the Nationalist Party, and then the second one is the Communist Party that for a brief moment allied with Soviet that is still under Lenin. These two parties have a civil war that was briefly stopped during World War II when Japan came to occupy them. But then the civil war continues with the defeat of the Nationalist Party in 1949, where they ran to the island of Taiwan. Both parties still rule their own regime, but now they're ruling over different island. And then during Cold War, America under Nixon's presidency, China became only one China, erasing Taiwan as a nation, something that Mao Zedong took full use of and declared the one China, again erasing Taiwan as a nation. But Taiwan is only under China within this context. America would publicly propagandize China as only one ideology, so it is easier to hate on China, still maintain trade with Taiwan and provide it with security. They just didn't publicly declare it unless people are reading. This ambiguity held for decades since the start of Cold War, but now in 2020, with Putin starting the war to colonize Ukraine and Israel ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing on Palestine, China starting a war with Taiwan is getting more and more of a possibility. This is even something that Taiwan Foreign Ministry Joseph Wu has said himself that war is predicted to come in 2027. Now, to understand why Taiwan wanted to be separate, we need to know about their experience as Taiwanese first. But before that, I want to avoid stepping on any Western propaganda on China that is solely based on reactionary emotion, and there's a ton of that thanks to very successful intelligence agency work. Some people on the internet even dumbly start pointing and screaming, "Look, China bad," to defend what Israel is doing to Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, which if you're paying attention, it's as absurd as it sounds. So like a lot of the non-fiction book I cover on this channel, I'll try to make sure to avoid that, but do let me know if something slips into the video. As I mentioned, Taiwan's status stays mostly ambiguous, held between belonging to China and doesn't belong to China at the same time. Schrodinger's Taiwan, if you will. But starting from the 2000s, Taiwan started to actively separate itself from China. It starts slow by changing their passport cover to be named Taiwan instead of Republic of China. With this passport, Taiwan can fly freely to most countries except if they land on China, because that passport is not valid in China. Instead of using the passport to enter or get out of the airport, they need a separate document called Taiwanese Compatriot ID card, and using this card, they then can enter through the Chinese side instead of the foreigner side like all the other foreigner countries, again an ambiguous state of existence. Taiwan as a place itself is much more varied than people realize. There are places that has been considered even by Chinese in mainland as more Chinese than China, because it's on a separate island, it's been untouched by the wave of changes that is happening in the mainland that sometimes comes with burning and other forms of destruction like the Cultural Revolution. There are places that feel more industrialized because it is a place with a ton of trade. Then there are places that feel like you're visiting Japan because of how it was colonized by Japan in the past. And these differences show in how they conduct their politics. Unlike in the mainland where the Communist Party is all and everything, Taiwan has much more diversity with hundreds to thousands of political parties existing because as long as it is still within the law, it is allowed to be. Well, there's such a mixed bag of culture and belief. The three principles of people built by Sun Yat-sen, democracy, nationalism, and people's livelihood, guide them forward together. There's a sense of humanness and togetherness that the people have that is shown especially during difficult times like COVID, where even without any lockdown or making wearing masks allowed, people voluntarily wear masks and self-isolate, making Taiwan one of the most unaffected countries by COVID. Not to say that the island is a utopia without any inner conflict, there are still hate and crime and xenophobia being committed on the island even when it is low and mostly limited to the chronically online resident. It's still there, but what they're worried about the most is attack coming from China. The People's Liberation Army, China's army that took Tibet, often launched missile and warplane overhead just to terrorize the people in Taiwan, making headlines that Taiwan is recorded as the most dangerous place on earth if we just see the ballistic missile being launched over their head. Meanwhile, that island is also one of the islands that is affected most harshly by the effect of climate change with extreme weather happening more often. It doesn't help that their island also set on a tectonic fault lines that cause devastating earthquakes. Nowadays, being normal in Taiwan is having to be stoic about all these threats. In comparison, Taiwan used to be a lonely island that was ignored and left alone by mainland China for tens of thousands of years because the seas separating them are notoriously hard to go through. There was a brief visit during the Three Kingdom War by the order of Emperor Sun Quan by 2030, then another visit in 1359 by explorer Wang Dayuan. But it mostly stayed as a refuge for the most impoverished, people running away from the warring state that treat them as number to die for their lords. Chinese and English people would later call its inhabitants as the mountain tribes or I guess barbarians. They also would later got colonized by Dutch and Spanish for trading opportunities, making the island one of the earliest modern global supply chain. But of course, more importantly, Taiwan was just one of these colonialist stepping stones to the richness in China. And for their colonization effort, they also colonized Indonesia and Philippines to create one of the most coveted markets in the world. But instead of getting rid of the Dutch and Spanish colonization, the Qing dynasty that is at the mainland at that time was more worried about the rebel force called Zheng Zhenggong or Koxinga instead. He and later on his son Zheng Jing fight against Dutch and Chinese invasion for decades until in 1683, China Emperor at the time did a full-scale invasion in order to annex more territory, including also the conquest of Xinjiang and Tibet. Taiwan was in a way part of China after the invasion, but with its inhabitants still living there since it's hard to maintain the separate island from the main island, it didn't help that it is a hard place to live for the Chinese mainlanders with a lot more rain and mosquitoes with the limited medical knowledge back then. So they paint the original inhabitants as barbarians as I said and made it as an excuse to have them do hard work with little pay. Because they're barbarians, they should be glad at all that they got any job. So of course a lot of revolts happened during this era. This was also the era of colonization, so a ton of the western world, not just Dutch and Spanish, often comes to try to get the place since Taiwan position has become key trade routes. It was not until China's loss to Japan after the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 that as a result of that loss, Japan can ask for territory. And with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China gave Taiwan to Japan without any input from any of the so-called barbarians that they ruled. Japan put a stringent rule that demands its people to only speak Japan, forcing most Taiwanese to become bilingual and making them lose their identity even more for a long time. And ironically, because they're separated from China, they didn't get any of the effect from the Qing dynasty collapse in 1911, and their infrastructure and economy only got better. Of course, this modernization benefit was for the Japanese occupant, meanwhile Taiwanese only grew being more voiceless and more marginalized than ever. Every rebellion by the indigenous people was met with the utmost violence. This includes the infamous Musa incident where Ataya rebel attacked and killed 130 Japanese, including women and children in the mountain. Japan, who have not signed the Geneva Convention yet at that time, countered with poison gas, aerial bombing, and ground attack led by more than 3,000 soldiers. They lived under Japan's brutal oppression that of course involved a lot of rapes until Japan lost in World War II. But even when Taiwan is no longer under Japan, there was no voice from the Taiwanese who are the victim of the occupation the most. All the decision was made by China, America, British, and Soviet. Once again, Taiwan is under China during Chiang Kai-shek presidency. It was during this when the White Terror and 228 event happened to the Taiwanese under the mainland China operation. When the civil war in the mainland escalated, around 2 million of the Nationalist Party members ran to Taiwan. Even Chiang Kai-shek now resides in Taipei, all while wishing for a return to the mainland like being on Taiwan is a demotion. The influx of 2 million people almost all at once created a heavy burden to the local Taiwanese that had already have so much taken from them. And the civil war is not over yet. Most armies started to creep into Taiwan's coast, wanting to end the nationalist party all at once. Unfortunately for Mao and fortunately for Chiang, the Korean War started. North Korea was pushed back by the UN to the border of China, starting a war there. Mao's own son and Ying died during the battle there. So the attack on Taiwan was postponed indefinitely, especially after US backed Taiwan became their ally. Starting from 1949, for 38 years, Chiang Kai-shek will rule over Taiwan with an iron fist, making one of the longest martial law to oppress the voice of Taiwanese. Despite US reversing their official alignment from Taiwan to China in 1962, with China becoming part of UN and Chiang pulling out of UN, Taiwan is still protected by US unofficially. But this is also the time when they grew the most. US funded Chiang with $1.4 billion and he has learned from his disastrous leadership in the mainland and managed to make a ton of economic growth in Taiwan. And even if he is still oppressing any dissent from the locals, it's nowhere near as bad as the Cultural Revolution disaster that is happening in China from 1960 to 1970, but this boon did not last long for Taiwan. China under Deng Xiaoping will start to reform this country. They made a lot of political and economic transformation, dismantling many of the Maoist-style rule. Meanwhile, Taiwan's politics is still stuck in operation of the local mode. One of their emerging opposition from Kaohsiung, Lin Yixing, was captured, and when his house was under watch by the government itself, two of his three daughters and his mother was brutally murdered. The case was never resolved, with many suspecting the security involvement. Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who led the security team, will eventually be the one to make a significant change in the one-party system of the Nationalist Party. He then lifted the martial law that has been ongoing for nearly 4 decades, and he even appointed a native Taiwanese, Lee Teng-hui, for his successor. It was the start of the 90s, and Taiwan finally officially changed into a democratic nation that is not under any external oppression, and they somehow did it with the peaceful means and peaceful transition of authority. And since they've started gaining their independence, Taiwan and Taiwanese has grown to want to be their own entity outside of Republic of China. But by 2023, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has produced over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor. Modern computing relied on this small island. And China is the largest electronic goods manufacturer in the world that rely heavily on these chips. China relied heavily on having Taiwan for this. For the Taiwanese themselves, because of how social media and the internet in Taiwan have so much less restriction compared to China, we can see even more how most of Taiwanese wanted a total separation from China. Some even goes as far as wanting to stop trading with the mainland, but that number is even less than the people that wanted a unification with the mainland. Most Taiwanese just wanted to stop unification, especially seeing that poverty in China rural area is still an ongoing problem. And then other crises like how badly the one-child policy was implemented in China, which causes the international adaptation crisis because of how much people threw their daughter if they didn't have a son. But cheap demand and old dream of unification is causing China to go into the direction of preparing to take more extreme measures in order to take Taiwan. And as a result of this, even Japan is arming their idea to prepare to defend themselves. More than ever now, Taiwan needed more eyes on it to ensure they did not fall under the same war that has now plagued Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, and many other countries that is under attack. That's why I highly recommend reading this book. For investigative journalism non-fiction, it's not among the most well-written. 10 Myths of Gaza, for example, is more well-structured in its writing compared to this, but it is still very informative. It is still a great tool for combating misinformation, considering China, along with US and Russia, are some of the worst spreaders of global misinformation. I give this a 3.75. What do you think? Let me know if I missed anything, so leave your thoughts in the comment below and subscribe to the channel. That's about it. See ya.